Hello, and welcome to American Amnesia. I'm your host, Cliff Garner, and I've been a bit busy the last few days. In fact, I've been really kind of caught up in a lot of different things last couple of weeks anyway. But I've been trying to put some things together while I've been busy. Well, I'm a teacher, and things are kind of picking up. It's getting towards the end of the school year, so I'm being a little bit busier with tutoring and also just trying to maintain. But I've picked up some books for my research on the Great Sellout, which is a period of time really from the beginning of 1970 to really 1980 with the coming in of Ronald Reagan is kind of the final touches to it, but it reflects the selling out of the radical movement into actually becoming part of the mainstream and cutting off the new radicals from any access towards publicity or backing or any other kind of support whatsoever. They sold us out, and so a lot of us that were radicals in the 70s that came along later ended up becoming probably more radical than we would have been otherwise. Partly because the disassociation from the earlier part of the boomers, right, which I will remind you is generally from 1946 to 1964, or thereabout. They set different places for start and finish, but generally that's about the span. And there's basically two waves of boomers. The first wave ending in about 1955, thereabout. So at any rate, but the first wave really kind of dictated what would happen in the second wave. And this is one of the things that I've maintained and actually lived through. I think a lot of us in the second wave didn't really think about it too much. A lot of people weren't radicalized until much later. I was radicalized very early, so I moved on much earlier also, and eventually became a libertarian. Really, that's the kind of the short version. So, at any rate, I'm putting together some material on the cause of that, because it shows a big rupture in radical politics in the U.S. and how it became, on one hand, became more part of the establishment, but also, on the other hand, became almost non-existent. This led to a great deal of ideologizing, I suppose, de-ideologizing. It removed the ideology from the central position and turned it into kind of a you further again it. And you had clusters of issues on both the left and the right that if you pronounced the right shibboleth the correct way, and you were accepted by that side. If you examine what ideology actually is, it's a collection of ideas that really amounts to philosophy. But we remove that sophistication in America in a big way. A lot of the world never really stood a chance on that. So I've been corralling a lot of resources, things like this. This is a book on the 70s. This is kind of a timeline type book. I really didn't see much in it, but I thought it would be a good idea to have the timeline as far as it went, available, and it would help me a little bit on the research and comparing events, and things, things with dates, basically, which was a useful part of that one. Here's this one, 1973, Nervous Breakdown, Watergate, Warhol, and the Birth of Post-60s America. Now, when did the 70s start? Did they really start in 1970, or did they start in 68? Or did they start in 73, or 2, or 5, or whatever? When we really think about this whole decade type division as being a nice clean cut thing that we can define and all that, it's really a fallacious concept, but it became very popular in the 1960s. Imagine that. And what you have, and this has been a process in America to some extent anyway, is the removal from the context of history. Now, why would a whole generation do that? Particularly the first part of a generation, to remove the context of history from applying to them. And now that they're getting older, not really talking about the generational aspects so much anymore. Okay. Anyway, this one has some interesting stuff in it, actually. Or it looks like it does. I don't know for sure. I thumbed through the introduction, and he seemed to write competently. And he uses Warhol as part of his background, which I think is kind of interesting. Warhol rather underdoes the whole concept of radicalism, and shows it to be kind of its own little niche market, Come to our store and buy your genuine Black Panther stuff, right? Okay, radical chic, right? The fashion fascists. Oh boy, get me started on that. Then you got this one here. Mad as Hell, the Crisis of the 70s and the Rise of the Populist Right. And that's kind of an interesting point. It seems like that whole 60s era, especially in America, not so much Europe, but in America, the right is entirely missing outside of actually electoral politics. And it's kind of interesting how they kind of... well, it wasn't there. You had the hard hats. And these guys, they were basically union workers. And they wear their hard hats and they go out and they beat up hippies. Aren't the unions supposed to be left-wing? You see where there might be a little bit of a problem with what happened with the folding of the radicals into the Democratic Party? Why is it that the, not just union, but non-union workers too, have been such pariahs, really? Because most of them were white, for some reason. Or at least the ones they want to talk about are. And now with Trump coming in, this finger's getting pointed at white people, and particularly the working people that actually have lost their jobs and have dropped out of the middle class and now work at Wendy's. You see, there's kind of a pattern here. isn't there? It's not a very comfortable one either. And those were all from the library. And so's this one. How we got here. The 70s, the decade that brought you modern life, for better or worse, by David Frum. And I've heard of Frum. I don't know if I've read very much of him. I don't know if I have any of his other stuff either, for that matter. But I went through the introduction of this, and it looks very promising. And the thing was, with the 70s, well, I'll talk about that when I come to this one. But it has promise. There seems to be stuff in there that I might be looking for. And then you got this. It seemed like nothing happened. America in the 1970s by Peter Carroll. And I actually may have read this at one time, and I went through the introduction, and that was the thing. You know, with the 70s, we always complain nothing's happening. It's boring. We were waiting for something to happen, for some. I don't know if a cataclysm or what, but we were waiting for something. We were in anticipation. And when I got out of school, that anticipation was very high. And we were expecting really the apocalypse. We were told the world was coming to an end, and that there were all these signs of it happening, you know, the turmoil in the streets, and the fighting, and the arguing, and the racial tensions, and all that, and you know, you just were expecting something to catalyze, just be the spark. It didn't even take a match, the spark that would ignite the whole thing. And it never came. And we were expecting that apocalypse. We really were. And we were prepared to really be the armies of the apocalypse. Think about it. That's exactly what was going on in the 60s. This is the armies of the apocalypse. This was the end of the world. This was the end of history. It was going to become utopia or destruction. And nothing happened. Not only that, as the decade wore on, it was clear. By the time Carter got elected, it was extremely clear that nothing was going to happen. They were not going to allow anything to happen. Carter especially, and the people that followed him were explicit about this. Don't protest. Don't resist us. And you sure as hell aren't going to riot, because we'll shoot. That was the Great Sellout. And that's really what it was all about. So, and like I say, things are taking shape. I'm amassing the right books, and it's actually feeling pretty good. But I picked this up today, and this is a brand new book. A Generation of Sociopaths, How the Baby Boomers Betrayed America. This is by a fellow named Bruce Cannon Gidney. And I don't expect him to know about the Great Sellout or even much care about it. But I do expect to find in there some things about the overall patterns that constituted the boomer politics as it developed. You see, the people that got out of school earlier, you know, the first wave boomers, they were the ones that were trying to set the agenda for the rest of us. Now, he takes a wider swath on identifying who the boomers are. He goes from 1940 to 1965. That's probably about the widest I've seen it drawn, but it's believable. Actually, the war children were, by and large, considered a separate generation, and that would be my parents' generation. My folks were born in the 30s, but they were close to that same age, and that you see why there's problems with this whole generational concept. That you really aren't necessarily separating parents from their kids. I mean, I had friends whose folks were probably that age, you know, a little bit younger than my parents. My parents were young, but there were people getting married at 16 back in those days. That happened a whole lot more. So, you know, I don't. I have real problems with what he's setting as the dates. However, what he's talking about, and I'll actually read a little bit to you just so you see where he's coming from. I find what he's saying interesting, but at the same time it bothers me a little bit too. What he's saying though is that there's a cluster of issues that have been promoted by the politicians of the boomer age that from the time they got in until really now. I mean, the boomers entered politics at a very early point. I mean, we're starting to see them push into the Democratic Party in 1970. You didn't really see it so much with the Republicans. But they were even starting in 70, which was kind of an off year. And in 72, they were the delegates, youth delegates to the Democratic Convention. You didn't really see that so much with the Republicans. The youth party was the Democrats, right? You know, trying to go after Kennedy, you know, the handsome devil there, right? And be the visual party. You know, Nixon had that 5 o'clock shadow and a sweaty upper lip and all that kind of stuff. You know, I mean, he wasn't the best looking fella out there, but you know, but he was working for you, right? I am not a crook. All that good stuff. Well, you know, the thing is, there were problems with both parties, and but it was the Democrats that kind of caved in, and really the youth vote overtook the Democrats. And in 72, it was their candidate that failed horribly. That embarrassment, I think, was one of the things that stalled out the left. And I think that they felt vindicated after bringing down Nixon finally, and then putting their own guy Carter in. Although Carter was a compromise. That's one of the things that a lot of people don't think about today. They think of Carter being, you know, oh so liberal. But when he was actually the candidate, he was very conservative. And as a president, he was not liberal at all. You know, if you remember living through that time without putting on the rose-colored glasses, you'll remember that too. He was not the liberal. So, at any rate, I was doing some looking at the irony of democracy, and I do want to go back into this and kind of wrap up a couple things here. We looked at the idea of the elites actually being the reality behind the curtain, and we examined some of the elite theory that underpins this this greater elitism that supposedly protects democracy, but as we pointed out, or I point out, with Lash, Christopher Lash, and what he had to say about the betrayal, the revolt of the elites that occurred in the 90s, that the break between the elites and the people was rather complete. And I think that this book will prove that there was this decision by the elites who were basically the 60s people to abandon really propping up what had made America strong and had benefited most Americans across the board. That they had their own views of what was what and who was who and who belonged where, and they started actually undermining the middle class, and in the process, one of the things that happened is that the blacks became an underclass, and so they invested themselves in the creation of a new black elite, and also a parallel one in Hispanic communities, and basically creating communities, these different tribes. They in the 60s, they talked about this tribalism in which people would be fragmented into smaller groups that vied with each other for, getting their piece of the pie. And that whole notion was one of these weird counterculture things, and it really wasn't a major one, as far as a lot of people were concerned. They wanted to get rid of all the labels, but there were these others that decided that this tribalistic kind of reduction, this reductio of people into small collective groups, that this idea fit in kind of better with a kind of a neo-Maoist type of political philosophy, as it were. And even that kind of went down the tubes eventually, because really I don't think a lot of them really cared that much about philosophy. They were more concerned about really stroking their own egos, very much in the public, kind of like public masturbation, if you will. And so I left off at going to talking about what Dye and Zieglar define as democracy. I'm going to actually go from there to talking about what they call pluralism and pluralistic theory. And the reason for doing this is this sets the groundwork of showing what the deep state consists of. How does the deep state work? Well, there are these elite groups that are a part of the government, and they consist of a shadow government, or actually don't consist of, but the government actually consists of a large number of these people that are non-removable. They can't remove them. They're a perpetual part of the state. And that the change in their constitution, not like a document, but of what they are made of, is slow. They constitute these different parts, and changing that is a slow process because they resist change. They're essentially conservative. The reason that they're conservative isn't that they believe in conservative philosophy in politics or anything of this sort. They're change resistant. They hold on to things longer than probably they're useful. And in fact, it's almost like they have to be uprooted to be able to swap out and have others move in. And that's kind of the idea here. So the deep state is it's like an undigested chunk of something in your stomach, if you think about it. It's not going away, and it might give you gas or something. So this is starting with page 9, the meaning of democracy. Ideally, democracy means individual participation in the decisions that affect one's life. See, and that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the republic. The republic is the government and the type of government that we actually have. But we do have this democratic component that enables us to vote in the elections. It gives us our agency legally. And that it also causes this leveling, hopefully before the law, that we're all kind of equalized at some level, and it's not an absolute thing. There is no absolute democracy. There is no absolute equality. It's not possible. But by the same token, there is a certain amount of yes, I'm equal to other people before the law. I'm innocent before proven guilty. Okay, these are things under the Constitution that are in place. And some things that are under the Constitution do apply to people that are not just legal aliens, but also to some extent illegal. I mean, we do have this assumption of non-guilt, of innocence when we have people in court. And it's because this is an assumption that we make as a society. And it comes from this idea of citizenship and the idea that all of us as citizens are equals. All men are equal. Those who are fellow citizens are equal before the law inside this country. All these ideas are kind of equivalent. John Deere wrote, quote, "The keynote of democracy as a way of life may be expressed as a necessity for the participation of every mature human being in formation of the values that regulate the living of men together." So what Dewey is saying is that the keynote of democracy is our responsibility. The necessity for the participation of every mature human being for the formation of the values that regulate the living of men together. So we are obligated to participate in forming the values that underscore our being able to work together. If nothing else, it's feedback. Think about it. In traditional democratic theory, popular participation has been valued as an opportunity for individual self-development. Responsibility for governing of one's own conduct develops one character, self-reliance, intelligence, and moral judgment. In short, one's dignity. See, that's why people have to have a certain amount of responsibility. For one thing, it enables them to develop as a person, also as a citizen. And that dignity that we assume that other people possess, now they might not have it, but we assume that they possess it because we act towards them with respect until they prove otherwise. Oh! You see where the civics goes. I mean, we don't teach civics anymore. We have responsibilities. We have rights. They go together. If you have responsibilities with, or no responsibilities whatsoever, you don't have rights. You have privileges. And they're given to you by the suffrage of somebody. And that somebody might not have your best interest in mind, people. And you better think about that. Even if a benevolent despot could govern in the public interest, that person would be rejected by the classical Democrat. The English political philosopher John Stuart Mill asked, what development can either thinking or active facilities attain under it? The argument for citizen participation in public affairs is based not upon the policy outcomes it would produce, but on the belief that such involvement is essential to the full development of human capacities. Mill argued that persons can know truth only by discovering it for themselves. It becomes experiential. Procedurally, popular participation is achieved through majority rule and respect for the rights of minorities. And that's the thing. Democracy in and of itself doesn't have that respect for minorities. This is something that is assumed under a republic. That's why we have a democratic republic, okay? So the conflation here is a common one for especially things prior to probably about 2000, because a lot of people use democracy and republicanism as interchangeable. They're not. Although that when we talk about what we have developed, there's this cohesion that we are talking about, that where democracy and republicanism have come together in a solid way. You would almost have to go to other countries to see what I'm talking about. But republicanism has certain assumptions that democracy does not. And the respect for minorities almost has to be written into law in either one. But in democracy, it's majority rule, which turns into mob rule, and by definition is not considering what a minority is at all. A minority is acted upon in one way or another. In a republic, a minority has certain categorization, certain rights. Mob rule doesn't do that. And a lot of people are very quick to point that out. And they're correct. They're entirely correct. But what we have done in America is we've modified really both terms. And other people in other parts of the world, outside of the West, Western Europe in particular, and the English-speaking world, outside of there, a lot of people really don't follow what you would mean if you talk about democracy and republicanism and stuff as we do here in America. They just wouldn't. They would actually get lost on what you mean. Procedurally, popular participation is achieved through majority rule and respect for the rights of minorities. Self-development means, and you see it's procedurally. That comes from the Republic. Self-development means self-government, and self-government can be accomplished only by encouraging each individual to contribute to the development of public policy and by resolving conflicts over public policy through majority rule. So this interaction, you can see how that works. Minorities who have the opportunity to influence policy but whose views have not succeeded in winning majority support accept the decisions of majorities. Okay, and by nature, under either and both types of government, republic or democracy, the minority is not in control. They have to accept what the majority ends up doing and actually hope that there's some accommodation. We have made that accommodation through constitutional changes. So our constitutional republic has actually worked that out, and that's been modified over the years. It's never been perfect, but I dare say you'll not find that minorities are treated very well anywhere in the world. If you're going to put down our standard and say it's bad, I'm sorry. I am really sorry, but it doesn't take very long to point out things like what happened to the Armenians under the Ottomans, and how much it's improved, but it's still really bad in modern Turkey. It doesn't take very long. You'll see that. In return, majorities permit minorities to attempt to openly win majority support for their views. So, not only that, a coalition politics and things of this nature would enable that in some cases. There's a lot of ways that could work out. Freedom of speech and press, freedom to dissent, freedom to form opposition parties and organizations are essential to ensure meaningful individual participation. This freedom of expression is also necessary for ascertaining what the majority views really are. Well, yeah. For one thing, by contrast. But for another, by showing differing shades of meaning and different shades of stance. The underlying value of democracy, then, is individual dignity. See, this is why it's anti-collective, and the collectivist ideas that entered in the 60s, or actually in the 70s, that by virtue of the 70s and 60s people joining the establishment, which you can see why they probably don't want to admit that. But by their joining the establishment, they brought these collectivist ideas with them. All these different Maoists and leftists of various stripes that bought into collectivism. They were kind of a minority, really. At least as far as I could recall, they were there, but the collective idea was actually rejected in favor of democratic ideals. But they were punching above their weight, is what they were doing. Human beings, by virtue of their existence, are entitled to life, liberty, and property. And this goes back to our founding fathers. Natural law, or moral tenet, guarantees that every person, both liberty and the right to property, and its natural law is superior to human law. John Locke, the English political philosopher whose writings most influenced America's founding elites, argued that even in a state of nature, that is, in a world in which there is no governments, an individual possesses inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Locke meant that those rights are independent of government. They are not given to individuals by governments, and no government may legitimately take them away. They are endowed by their Creator. And that's that. This is a right by nature. Locke believed that the purpose of government was to protect individual liberty. People form a social contract, okay? And this is a really key thing. There is a social contract between the governed and the governing. Those who lead and those who follow have an agreement. And doesn't have to be stated or whatever, but it's there. And basically it is that the governed agree to do as they are told in order to promote their lifestyle, and that it should be guaranteed by those who rule them. You can get into similar concepts if you look into the Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven and the right to rule however one sees fit if they are given the mandate of heaven, because it can also be taken away. That there are indications that show that the mandate is not being met any longer. Well, the social contract also has stipulations that become clear that the ruling people are abusing their power. And I think they're clearly at that stage right now. So people form a social contract with each other in establishing a government to help protect their rights. They tacitly agree to accept government activity in order to better protect life, liberty, and property. Implicit in the social contract and the democratic notion of freedom is the belief that government activity and social control over the individual must be kept to a minimum. Then that's for governing best. The government governs best, governs least. Right? That's Thoreau, I believe. This belief requires removing any external restrictions, controls, and regulations on the individuals that do not violate the freedom of other citizens. Right? Moreover, since government is formed by the consent of the governed to protect individual liberty, it follows that government cannot violate the rights it was established to protect. Its authority is limited. Locke's ultimate weapon was to protect the individual dignity against abuse by government was the right of revolution. So in other words, if the contract is violated or broken, and it can be violated and fixed, but if it is broken, it is permissible for the people to have a revolution. This was implicit in the Second Amendment. By the wording of it, you can look it up. Right? To fight enemy is domestic or foreign. Domestic meaning potentially the government itself, and that's clear if you read the founding fathers' works and you read their the letters, the Federalist letters. If you read those, it becomes very clear also. That was part of the purpose of it. And it was very well stated many times. Not only that, Points for Rebellion, which is a book that was written by Stephen A. Oh, no. It was Douglas. Stephen Douglas? No. I can't think of his first name. Douglas, the Supreme Court justice who was in the 70s and helped with the Roe versus Wade. He was also appointed by FDR, I believe. It was FDR who appointed him. But he made that point very clear that the Second Amendment was the right not only to bear arms, but also to bear them against the government if the government became oppressive. That is our rule, our right. We do have the right to rebel. Whether or not the government will ever accept that is another issue. And that's secondary. But the violation and the breaking of the social contract, if that contract is rendered void, the result should be, by all rights, revolution. We have that right. According to Locke, whenever governments violate the national rights of the governed, they forfeit the authority placed in them under the social contract, and that means that they're no longer legitimate. Another vital aspect of the classical democracy is the belief in the equality of all people. The Declaration of Independence expresses the conviction that all men are created equal. Even the Founding Fathers believed in equality for all purposes before the law, notwithstanding the circumstances of the accused. A person was not to be judged by social position, economic class, creed, or race. That's very clear. However, they did recognize slavery. It was a condition, and it did affect persons' legal status. And I think that they point that out here. Many early Democrats also believed in political equality. Equal opportunity for individuals to influence public policy. Political equality is expressed in the concept of one man, one vote. Okay. Over time, the notion of equality has also come to include the equality of opportunity in all aspects of American life, social, educational, and economic, as well as political. Ronald Pennock writes, "The objective of equality is not merely the recognition of certain dignity of the human being as such, but it also to provide him with the opportunity equal to that guaranteed to others for protecting and advancing his interests and developing his powers and personality." So our interests really needs, of developing ourselves as human beings, should be equal to that of others by rights. Thus, the notion of equal opportunity has been extended beyond political life to include education, employment, housing, recreation, and public accommodations. Each person has an equal opportunity to develop his or her individual capacities and their natural limits. Remember, however, that the traditional democratic creed has always stressed equality of opportunity to education, wealth, and status, and not absolute equality. Thomas Jefferson recognized a natural aristocracy of talent, ambition, and industry. And those are the things that people have in different measure. And liberal Democrats since Jefferson have always accepted inequalities that are a product of individual merit and hard work. Absolute equality or leveling is not a part of liberal democratic theory. There is a natural leveling that occurs when people are actually capable of achieving personal equality. There is a leveling. It takes down the high and mighty a little bit, but it also elevates the low. In summary, democratic thinking involves the following ideas. 1. Popular participation in the decisions that shape the lives of individuals in a society. 2. Government by majority rule, with recognition of the rights of minorities to try to become majorities. These rights include the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition, and the freedom to dissent, to form opposition parties, and to run for public office. 3. The commitment to individual dignity, and the preservation of the liberal values of life, liberty, and property. 4. The commitment to equal opportunity for all individuals to develop their own capabilities. And now we come to pluralism. And this is where it kind of refines itself. Political rhetoric in America emphasizes citizen participation in decision-making, majority rule, protection of minorities, individual rights, and equality of opportunity. Nevertheless, no scholar or commentator, however optimistic about life in this country, would contend that these conditions have been fully realized in the American political system. No one contends that citizens participate in all the decisions that shape their lives, or that majority preferences always prevail. Nor do they argue that the rights of minorities are always protected, or that the values of life, liberty, and property are never sacrificed, or that every American has equal opportunity to influence public policy. We see that. However, that modern pluralism seeks to affirm that American society is democratic by asserting that, number 1, although citizens do not directly participate in decision-making, their many leaders do make decisions through a process of bargaining, accommodation, and compromise. Okay? And that's, it's not just dictatorially done. Okay? 2, there is competition among leadership groups that helps protect the interests of individuals. Okay, so what they're saying is that these different interest groups, these different sections of the elites, basically are not, like a monolith. I mean, they're different. They're like people. They disagree with one another, and that they compete. There's some competition going on. And back to the text. I'll repeat that. There is competition among leadership groups to help protect the interests of individuals. Countervailing centers of power, for example, competition among business leaders, labor leaders, and government leaders, can check each other and keep each interest from abusing its power and oppressing the individual. 3. Individuals can influence public policy by choosing among competing elites in elections. Okay? And the two parties are two of the biggest elites. Or two of the most obvious ones, probably should say. Elections and parties allow individuals to hold leaders accountable for their action. 4. Although individuals do not participate directly in decision-making, they can join organized groups and exert influence by participating in them. Leadership groups are not closed. New groups can be formed and gain access to the political system. 6. Although political influence in society is unequally distributed, power is widely dispersed. That's good, because otherwise concentrations of power would enable somebody to take over too quickly. Access to decision-making is often determined by how much interest people have in a particular decision, and because leadership is fluid and mobile, power depends on one's interest in public affairs, skills in leadership, information about issues, knowledge of democratic processes, and skill in organization and public relations. 7. There are multiple leadership groups within society. Dispersal of power. Those who exercise power in one kind of a decision do not necessarily exercise power in others. No single elite dominates decision-making in all issue areas. That's key. 8. Public policy is not necessarily majority preference, but it is an equilibrium of interest and interaction. That is, competing interest group influences are more or less balanced, and the resultant policy is therefore a reasonable approximation of society's preferences. Pluralism is, then, the belief that democratic values can be preserved in a system of multiple competing elites who determine public policy through a process of bargaining and compromise, in which voters exercise meaningful choices in elections and new elites can gain access to power. Okay? Now, they come to this point. Difference between pluralism and democracy. And I'll try to wrap this up very quickly. But in pluralism, even if it accurately describes American society, is not the equivalent of classical democracy. First, the pluralist notion of decision-making by elite interaction is not the same as the democratic ideal of direct individual participation in decision-making. Pluralists recognize that in a complex urban industrial society, individual participation in decision-making is not possible and has inevitably and necessarily given way to interaction, bargaining, accommodation, and compromise among leaders of institutions and organizations in society. Individuals are represented in the political system only insofar as they are members of institutions or organizations whose leaders participate in policy making. Government is held responsible not by individual citizens, but by leaders of institutions, organized interest groups, and political parties. The principal actors are leaders of corporations and financial institutions, elected and appointed government individuals, the top ranks of the military and government bureaucracies, and leaders of large organizations in labor, agriculture, and the professions. And that is, by definition, the deep state. And I'll repeat that. And that's who these are. The principals this whole sentence. The principal actors of the deep state, of the elites that are talked about in this book, are leaders of corporations and financial institutions, elected and appointed government officials, including judges and bureaucrats, the top ranks of military and governmental bureaucracies, and leaders of large organizations in labor, agriculture, and the professions. Pretty big group, wouldn't you say? So when we talk about the deep state, that's who we're talking about. That's exactly who we're talking about. Now let me skip down a little bit, and I'll touch on a couple other points a little more spottily. But this is laying the groundwork that I want to have laid to refer back to, right? And use as a kind of a foundation for the ideas that I'm going to discuss from henceforth. Pluralism stresses that power is fragmented throughout society and that public opinion and elections influence the behavior of elites. Okay. And what that's saying is that the concentrations of power are kind of flattened, right? They're knocked down. Now, where they are kind of built up is with the particularly with the executive branch of the government. That's where it seems to be built up to the highest. Now, over the years, the Democrats have invested a lot of their efforts into the judiciary because they have used the judiciary as a way of enacting new legislation without calling it legislation. And they have maintained their role particularly in the culture wars, but really overall by doing this. And that's something that I think that a lot of people don't see very well when they examine the political situation in America. That this concentration of power has been very key, and if you really examine what has happened since the departure, or actually during the transition of the Obama administration to the Trump, and in these first few months of the Trump administration, we can see how they have actually managed to do this because of the way particularly in the way in that the judicial system has been blocking a lot of the policy that Trump has been trying to bring into being, pretty much by the same manner in which Obama did as a president. Because Obama did not rely on the legislative branch very much at all, really, and he relied as much as possible on the judicial system to prop up what he could. This is where he's getting his so-called legacy, such as it is, and it's really becoming more and more dubious as it goes along. It smells terrible, but we see how the Ninth Circuit has been a real pain in the butt for the Trump administration, and it has actually stopped policies cold. Especially where it's been dealing with immigration or with banning the entry into the U.S. by certain areas, people from certain areas, which is, I mean, this shouldn't even be contested law, but they make it that way. See, the only place I've seen anything comparable to this has been in Turkey. And what they were doing over there, boy, I bet Chicago would love this. But what the Turks, not the Turks, really, it was just AKP, Erdogan and his party were doing, was that in order to knock off one guy who's been a pain in the butt, a reporter or whatever, they would retroactively change a law to make sure that they got this guy in kind of a mini dragnet and would arrest him and dispose of him as a potential problem. And then after they took care of him and put him in prison or whatever, fine him until he's unable to do anything anymore, whatever, then they would change the law back. But he had no recourse. It's amazing. If you twist the judiciary around to that degree, there is no justice. There is no standard. It's just power. The power and its abuses. So what we see in the deep state, this is one of the big ones, and it's and we kind of look at each other and go, how do they figure? Well, they're going to lose. I mean, in the long run, but how do you figure? It's just absurd, truly absurd. So, at any rate, I've pretty well laid the foundations with some of the early Lash work and with the Irony of Democracy to show what I'm talking about with the elites, the deep state, and the divorce from them. And we will refine these ideas as we go forward. I think I'll there's about 4 to 6 of these different programs that I will put together like as a set, and that way I can refer people to that very easily, and that way you kind of catch up without having to lag behind. It'd be easier to find. We make it easier to reference. So, at any rate, I'm going to wrap up for now, and there's more coming on refining these ideas and really bringing them all together. So, take care. Till next time.